This week, I'm back using porcelain. I'll be trimming this group of small lidded jars, then glazing them and propping up their lids with waddings before packing them in the kiln for a reduction firing. I took 300 grams of clay and essentially just threw a whole variety of different shapes. Each is also thrown with the same opening diameter, and then I just threw a whole run of lids to fit. Some lids wider, some a bit taller, others a tiny bit thicker, and then once all the pieces are leather hard, I just pick and choose the ones that match and turn them so they fit together. Behind the white porcelain versions are a batch made in the high iron stoneware clay that you normally see me use, and as I wanted them to be more or less the same size once fired, it means I had to throw the porcelain ones a little larger than their stoneware counterparts, and I had to use more clay too, to account for the fact that this porcelain shrinks almost 20% as compared to the stoneware I use, which only shrinks 12% from start to glaze fired. For trimming these, I'll be using my dangerously sharp trimming tools made by Jae-Jun Lee. I'll leave a link to his website down in the description, but bear in mind the tools he makes aren't always available, and it may be best just to get in touch directly. Generally speaking, I always throw my lids to be a touch larger than the opening diameter. This is because I prefer to have a bit of excess material to work with, so that I can trim the inner flange until it fits the pot just perfectly. This is instead of, say, trying to throw them completely accurately to the opening. Throwing them slightly larger just gives me some leeway, as ultimately it's very easy to trim away clay, but it's very difficult to add it back, in the instance that you were to accidentally throw the lids or to be slightly too small. It adds seconds to the process, and it actually means that I can throw them quite crudely and therefore very quickly, which, for something as dull as a lid, I don't mind. Once the lid fits, I brush slip over the base of the porcelain jar and then rub it firmly in place before tap centering it so it spins exactly in the middle of the wheel. I then squash in a tiny portion around the base, which creates a seal and helps to hold it fast. Now, I bet you're thinking, because it's the same thing I was thinking, that that's a wobbly top, and you certainly aren't wrong. But as you'll see as I trim this, both from the top and from the sides, it really doesn't make much of a difference towards the end. I insert the fingers of my left hand into the pot, beneath the areas I'm trimming, and that way I can constantly feel the cross-section. Ideally, when turning, the aim is to trim all the walls to be exactly the same thickness. The same goes for when you're throwing. The aim should be to throw a pot which has very even walls throughout. And I'd say that was the case for this pot. As a maker, I love to trim pots so they feel exceptionally light, especially so with porcelain, with its translucent appearance. At this point, I'll never be able to make the rim run perfectly smooth, but I can get it close. I honestly don't mind if a tiny undulation exists in the rim, or on the lid, say. When it's spinning like this quickly, round and round, any disparity is just exaggerated so much. But once the wheel stops, you literally will not notice it. And it's not like at home when you have these pots yourself, put them on a wheel and spin them quickly. This is the last time you'll see it, and I don't think it's a particularly big deal. And there's a balance that I try to chase of making pots that are really well finished with a high level of craftsmanship, yet they still retain some marks which obviously identify the object as being handmade. Once the outer walls and rim have been turned, I take a flat metal edge and I run it against the sides, which just neatens up the shape. I can then use the body section of the jar as a chuck to trim the lid in, which also has the added benefit of trimming it in situ, which means I can trim the side of the lid to perfectly match the wall of the jar beneath it. As I trim, I firmly push down the lid with my left hand. This keeps it from jumping up or rattling ever so slightly in situ, which might create some irregular trimming marks. And once I've trimmed the sides and the bottom, I begin to work the top, which is a simple affair. I trim the surface to be very slightly concave, which I think makes for a nice tactile sensation when you're holding the lid later on. The original purpose with this style of lid I make was for this shallow top to act as an area into which my glazes could pool into thickly. It works especially well with my crackle glazes, but I want these pots to be black and white, and I don't know quite how these new glazes will interact. Once the walls and the lid have been trimmed, I flip the entire thing over, and now I can use the lid as a chuck so that I can easily trim the jar section, which, as you can see, is a bit precarious, and the jar section does wobble and move around a tiny bit, but it is manageable as long as I'm careful. This doesn't happen with every jar. It probably means there's a bit of movement in the join between the lid and the body, but once again the movement that you see is just exaggerated by it spinning around. When you see all of these lined up and glaze fired later, you won't even notice. Here's a good example of the translucency I was speaking of. And this ring of golden light is something quite special, although it'll only ever be obvious when held up to a bright light. This video would quickly become very long if I showed the entirety of the trimming for each of these jars, so instead I'll show it in a time-lapse format. Normally I'm not so much of a fan of unrealistic, highly sped up film with music laden over the top, like you see so much on Instagram, YouTube and TikTok, but there are times when it's useful. For instance, with these jars, it's quite fascinating to see just how much the forms change, like how much mass is removed from the pots, and seeing just how refined they get in comparison to the original thrown pieces. When you watch the trimming process over the span of 10 minutes or so, you won't notice the gradual change so much, but in these sped up segments, you definitely do. I'll be exhibiting some of these jars at Make, Hauser & Wirth in Bruton, Somerset. And by the time this video is released, the exhibition will have opened. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. The show is called Lisa Hammond, Future Perfect, and really it tells the story of Lisa, who's taught some 15 or so apprentices over the past 25 years, which I was one of. So in one room will be Lisa and her work, and then in the other will be my work, and then pots made by Darren Ellis, who was an apprentice before me, and Francis Lloyd Jones, who was one of the apprentices after me. And whilst we were all trained making the same house range of sodified pots, the work we've ended up making is very different, although I'm certain there are tiny aspects from all of our work that echo the style that Lisa taught us. I'll try to include some footage of the exhibition, or some photographs at least, in an upcoming video. And here you can see a slightly uneven wall, which is usually a good indicator that I can't trim much more away from the surface. To ensure that the trim parts really fit, I make sure that they're more or less the same consistency when I turn them. Say if your lid is much firmer than the body section when you trim it, there's a chance that once the pieces both dry out fully to bone dry, they won't fit together as well as you might have thought. So as all my lids and bodies are drying out overnight and the following day, I constantly check them, and if I notice, for instance, that all the lids are now slightly drier than the bodies, I'll sling some plastic over them, or just spray them a little bit with water to slow the drying process down so the body sections have a chance to catch up. It certainly isn't an interesting topic, but how you dry pots, the rate at which you do so, and so on, is a huge part of the process. If you do it wrong, your pots can crack and split and warp. Yet doing it correctly can be difficult too, and perhaps it can be a little bit overwhelming at the start, as judging the dryness of pots is a skill learned, just like anything else. It could make for quite a stale video in the future. And here are the finished jars. Leather hard at this stage. I actually wish they stayed looking like this forever. The matte surface is lovely. I think perhaps the glazes I ultimately put on these didn't quite do the shapes justice. And I think when I make a new batch, I'll leave the exteriors unglazed, and then once fired, I'll polish them smooth with varying grades of wet and dry sandpaper. At this point, the pots have been bisque fired to 1000 degrees centigrade, unpacked from the kiln, waxed and glazed. Now all that's left is to apply the waddings onto the lids so they can sit aloft the jars during the firing. Wadding, spelled W-A-D-D-I-N-G, is a material I mix up myself in studio from 50% kaolin, 50% coarse alumina hydrate. I very slowly add water to this mixture until it has a clay-like consistency. Then I give the mass a good wedge so it's really thoroughly mixed, and then I just store it in a bucket so it's ready for whenever I need it, which tends to be every couple of months. When it comes to doing a whole batch of firing, I roll out long coils of it, and then I cut the length into very small segments, like so. Each lid requires 5 of these, so cutting the quantity needed takes only a minute or two. It's worth noting that this material does dry out very quickly as compared to normal clay. Even the stuff I keep kept in a bucket, I push plastic firmly down over it and regularly spray it with water to keep it subtle and soft. This is one of those methods which I think every potter does a little bit differently. When I apprenticed with Lisa Hammond, I'd often spend an hour or two in the lead up to a firing rolling out hundreds of individual balls, and the recipe was more or less the same, although it did include a handful of high plus ball clay, and I've seen other recipes that contain flour or wood chippings. I then take these waddings, slightly flatten them, and then position them like the points of a star equally around the flange of the lid. They stick quite nicely onto the waxed surface, but you can equally glue them down with something as simple as PVA. The lid is then carefully placed onto the jar, making sure that the porcelain of each component is not touching, but instead is lifted up and suspended by the waddings. Once in place, I gently push the lid down and then it's ready to be packed into the kiln. You could fire your lids and jars separately, but by doing it like this and firing them together, you save a lot of space in the kiln, and you ensure that the glazed surface that surrounds the pot matches, as slight atmospheric changes in a reduction-fired kiln can cause the glazes and surfaces to fire a little bit differently depending on where they're placed. So by firing the pieces together, there's a greater chance that they'll be the same. And lastly, having the lid propped up like so acts as a support in some ways, and it stops the thinly trimmed porcelain from warping as it's fired all the way up to cone 10. One last important thing to mention about these waddings is that they're only placed in areas where there isn't any glaze, as if they do, they'll fuse to it, and they'll likely ruin the appearance of your pot. Although you do see pots that are glazed all over, even the bases, the glazed bottoms are supported on the kiln shelves by 3 dots of wadding, and they do leave a mark, but they're carefully ground away and polished, and all that's left is an echo of those supportive waddings. I then spray the waddings with water, stuff plastic over them, and then store it somewhere cool. Next, all the pots are loaded into the kiln, ensuring that no two objects are touching one another. The following day, the firing begins, and this strange view is filmed through a mirror I place beneath this burner in the early morning during the firing. It's here, as, for whatever reason, this specific burner occasionally splutters and turns off, and the mirror means I can see this burner to check whether it's on or off, without constantly having to climb down on the floor and look up. This gas kiln is entirely manual, and over the 9-hour firing I gradually increase the gas pressure and the air pressure, and I alter the damper position, which strengthens or weakens the reduction. This is the very simplified explanation, and I'll leave a link on screen now to a video that goes into far greater detail about the firing process. As the temperature gradually increases above 1200 degrees Celsius, I start to open the damper by a few millimeters every now and then, just to stop the temperature from stalling, and through these spy holes in the door, I can see the pyrometric cones inside, and once all 3 are slumped over, I know it's time to turn the kiln off. Two or so days later, once the kiln has cooled down sufficiently, it can finally be unpacked. The doors are cracked open, and I let the hot air slowly escape. For a while the pots are still far too hot to touch, and this pinging, crackling noise you hear is the sound of the glazes contracting over the stoneware clay body beneath, and as it's come up a few times, the torch serves no purpose than illuminating the pots further back in the kiln, which are cast in shadow. And here they are, the finished pieces, although I'm afraid you'll have to make do with photographs. The black is metallic and smooth, and feels almost like a gunmetal grey in certain lights. I like them, but I feel like I need another attempt at them, and I think the same could be said for all of the work I've recently made in porcelain. There's such a high learning curve with the material, and I think it really does help to go through the entire process once, from throwing the work to firing it, to gain a more vivid understanding of not only how the process works, but which parts I like, which qualities I like, and which kinds of porcelain pots are the ones I want to pursue. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.